Good evening, my friends. This is Jeffrey Tucker, and tonight's kind of an exciting night for me because I get to talk. I get to talk about Hayek's great book, Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, and just kind of go through it a little bit, talk about some of the historical context, perhaps some contemporary issues that it has some bearing on. Let me say, too, before I begin, that Road to Serfdom is one of those kinds of books that has the unfortunate I guess you could say legacy of having been enormously famous. That's always regrettable in a way for a book because it means that it's not well read. People tend to pick it up as a symbol. They think they know what's already in it. It's reading it is a rite of passage to the libertarian world. I should say owning it is, or having it on your bookshelf is. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's well read and it's well understood. And forget general public. I mean, it's definitely the kind of book that people already assume they know what's in its contents, and it doesn't help that it's just published in 1944. It's a long time ago. People might assume that it's lessons, that it doesn't have anything to teach us for today. So if nothing else comes out of this hangout we're holding here today, to inspire you to pick up the book, have it, look at it, read it carefully, read it slowly, and don't just burn through the chapters thinking that, well, he's an advocate of liberty and he thinks that any state intervention leads to socialism, and totalitarianism. Because that's not what he argues, actually. His argument is much more precise, much more subtle, and much more profound, and that has implications that go beyond the immediate point of its having been written. In fact, there's so much wisdom in the book. I don't think we're anywhere near absorbing how much of it there truly is. I reread the book at the same time I reread Hayek's speech in 1974 for his Nobel Prize, his brilliant talk called The Pretense of Knowledge. And I was struck by how many of the arguments were similar. I mean, Hayek was very interesting. He embarked on a kind of a fascinating path of research following his immigration to London, and he was finished with all of his technical economic work on business cycles, on capital theory, and that sort of thing. The war broke out. Well, he wasn't finished with it, but he moved on to political and social theory, and came up with a very special, I would say, understanding that makes really a very mighty contribution to liberalism. And this is an example of his applying that. I would say his ideas were, maybe you could say they're in their infancy at this point, and developed much better and more completely later in books like Constitutional Liberty and especially Law, Legislation, and Liberty. But actually, I'm not so sure about that, because this book is really complete. You have to read it carefully. I keep saying this because I think I read this in college for the first time. And I can just tell you that a 20-year-old or 21-year-old or something like that is not prepared for the level of argumentation that's in this book. I think it's too sophisticated, it's too abstract, it's too difficult, which is very interesting to me. I mean, I find the book actually to be, okay, it's a difficult book. The prose is transparent. It doesn't go into a lot of scholarly detail or technical language or anything like that. But the level of argument is very, very high, especially as compared with modern political tracts, Glenn Beck or whatever the heck it is. Say nothing of a Trump speech, right? But I mean, the level of argument is very high, and requires a certain level of abstraction to understand it and to sort of fully get it, which is fascinating to me also because this book is sometimes called Hayek's attempt to popularize his thought. Like he left aside his scholarly work and went into a popular arena. I don't really think that's true. For one thing, I'm not sure that Hayek expected that this book would go viral like it did. I think what he was doing was using his intellectual apparatus to understand the world around him and it was a very exciting, very dangerous world at the time. But he didn't pull back on the types of arguments he used, or the level at which he spoke. He just spoke about subjects that were themselves in the popular mind. Then the book became popular. But as a matter of fact, the book itself is a really good portal. If you read it carefully, and you read it with some discipline and an open mind, it's a good portal to the contribution that Hayek makes in his understanding of the social order. Well, what is that contribution? Well, let's just say it doesn't easily fit on a bumper sticker. What Hayek did was he came to understand that the structure of a working social order that's prosperous and flourishing is more complex than any single human mind can possibly understand. We can understand some aspects of the processes, the institutions, but in terms of understanding the data and the facts and all the causal relationships that make up the molecules of the social order, that is inaccessible to any single human mind, much less the intellectual class, and much less state planners. And so the attempt to extract all this data from the social order and shove it into a single plan will result in many kinds of violence to a prevailing system. Violence in the sense of causing mass distortions, unexpected, unintended consequences, subversion of plans, unmet opportunities, inventions that aren't created, spontaneous processes that are not allowed to play themselves out. In that sense, it does violence to a system. But there's a second kind of violence, and it's real violence. It's police state violence. It's the totalitarianism against which Hayek is warning in this book. So those two kinds of violence: one, making a mess of things, and making a mess of things through bullets, essentially. So this is what he's warning about. So you see this. You see the origins of Hayek's so-called knowledge problem here playing themselves out. Society is too complicated to be managed by planners. That's, I guess, maybe a bumper sticker way of summing up his argument. It's too rich. It's too complex. It relies on too many inaccessible bits of information that are always processed at the most local possible level in the human mind itself, and understood only subjectively according to the individuals who are kind of grappling their way towards living an orderly life. And that this raw data is never given to planners in a way that becomes useful to them. So what he does in the course of the book is, of course, show that every attempt at a sort of top-down planning is an intellectual fraud. As he later called it, people who promise to plan the world and improve it through force from above are essentially charlatans. But to get down to the particulars of his argument as he makes it in 1944, you have to understand the situation. Britain's now in a war against fascism, a war against a wicked system, Nazism, the Axis powers, which sought to snuff out the life of the individual, collectivize the nation, and militarize the nation, creating massive havoc all over Europe, and carrying out this war. Britain was allied with the U.S., of course. U.S. symbolically representing land of the free, home of the brave, so on, but also Russia, which is the home of the most fully realized attempt at sort of red socialism on the planet. And so it's fascinating that, and Hayek was, I think, daily struck by this irony, as were many classical liberals in the United States, that even as the UK is in a war against totalitarianism and fascism in Europe, and presumably a war that would benefit human liberty, you're allied suddenly, with another very egregious violator of human rights and a practitioner of collectivism of the worst sort in Russia. And the intellectuals at the time, both in the US and in England, were almost universally socialist. I mean, they were had favorable views towards red socialism, even as they were cheering on this war against fascism. So they're set up this dichotomy in the world that prevailed in the intellectual classes at the time. On one hand, red socialism remained, or Fabian socialism, whatever you want to call it, sort of left socialism, let's just sum it up, remained an ideal and something that people aspired to achieve, something that people longed for, a very respectable position. But meanwhile, fascism was considered to be something that you had to marshal all the efforts of the national resources to crushing, because it represents some a grave evil. Now, how do you square this? How does this work out? I mean, is it really true that fascism is the opposite of socialism? That brown represents a polar extreme away from red? Well, that was the prevailing view. And Hayek sort of enters into this with this book that he wrote in the middle of the war, 1933, 1934, in the midst of wartime planning, and we should never stop reminding ourselves what this meant for the US and the UK. It meant controlled prices, controlled wages, a home front kind of planning that equaled the kind of planning that was going on in Russia and Germany at the time, with food rationings, mandatory work, the draft. All national resources were being directed towards the war effort, which is very ironic given that it created a kind of economic conditions that look very much on the ground like the kinds of systems that the Allied powers were warring against. So Hayek jumps into the scene with this amazing argument about serfdom. What is the road to serfdom? And what does serfdom look like? So, what's his primary target here? His primary target is fascism, and so going against it, because of course that's something he could rely on. He understood that people were united in opposing Germany and Italian fascism, Nazism. So that was something that he could use as a black beast to say, these are bad systems, we know it. So what Hayek does is he unpacks, precisely why they're bad, where they came from, and what they look like at the ground level, and compares it to policy trends in the UK, in the US, and intellectual trends, which were highly sympathetic to red socialism. And he says right at the very outset, he says, these two kinds of socialisms, brown and red or left and right, said, they differ in style, they differ in how they come to power, they differ in social goals, perhaps, tweaked here and there to accommodate the different kinds of mostly political agendas and bringing them about, but they don't differ in means, and they don't differ in their results. They both rely on the violence of the state, and they both result in mass poverty, violation of human rights, collectivism, and mass human suffering, and the end of individualism, including the end of free speech, human rights, and all the rest of it. This was the argument that shocked people. What he was basically saying to socialists is, you're fascists, actually. The dynamic works like this. The Reds threaten to get in control, or they do come into control, creating chaos, fear, and panic on the part of the bourgeoisie and the petite bourgeoisie, There's a revolt against the Reds by the Browns. The Browns promise to reverse the policies of the Reds, or to oppose them, or forestall their effects in the world. And so people tend to support the fascists. And the fascists proceed to use the same means that the socialists would have used: totalitarian, authoritarian means that attack fundamentally private property and the spontaneous realm of a society as it necessarily has to take in order to become a full, a prosperous, flourishing, free social order. So it was a shocking argument, and it was an argument directed on one hand to the left. I mean, he dedicates the book to socialists of all parties, so meaning this is if you're a socialist, this is directed towards you, and he doesn't care. I mean, you can call yourself a brown, you can call yourself a red, left socialist, right socialist, national socialist, international socialist. To Hayek, these are just the differences that are inevitable in any party, but they all stand united in opposing liberalism. He completes the book by a very beautiful tribute. It's a very interesting, this surprised me because I didn't know this was in there, but a very beautiful tribute to the age of laissez-faire, 19th century. Not in all its respects, not in its corporatism, not in its crushing of unions, not in, God knows, not in its slavery, for all their imperfections of the age of laissez-faire that existed in the 19th century. There are still ways to improve it. It represented an ideal that came to be repudiated in the course of the 20th century, and never more so than when this book was released. So Hayek's sort of setting himself up against all forms of totalitarianism that exist in the world, whether red or brown or whatever, and for a revival of 19th century liberal ideals. And he does so very explicitly. Now, just before I get into it too deeply, let me just quickly address one point by my friend Walter Block. Walter Block's been very tough on this book. And if you read it as a kind of a blueprint for what kind of society we're supposed to have, you will be disappointed. I think this is actually why this book was a little bit lost on me. Because and I've actually had other people tell me this, that they're going to the road to serfdom to find a template for what the free society looks like, and they find themselves devastated that and when Hayek is just this way. If you're going to read Hayek, you got to get groovy to this, all right? You just got to get used to it. He says things that are inconsistent with his own theory. That's just the way he is. So in the case of Road to Serfdom, you just keep bumping into passages where he's making a great deal of sense, and he's like, awesome, and you're thrilled. And then he'll stop and he'll say, well, that's not to say we shouldn't have, given our level of prosperity, a guaranteed national income where everybody is given at least minimum clothing, food, and shelter, and blah, blah, blah. That's not inconsistent with freedom. And he'll have other things like that. He'll be praising competition, then he'll stop and say, well, but in saying this, I'm not endorsing the shibboleth of pure laissez-faire. So he's coming down on a kind of the sort of radical libertarianism that's most popular today. So if you read it like trying to find a model for how societies are going to be constructed, and you want to find libertarianism in him, you'll be disappointed because he keeps pulling back from it again and again. And it's actually frustrating when you're reading it because you're going along with his argument, like, yeah, we shouldn't have dictators. We can't have democratic systems that put technocrats in charge that presume to know the right way to run the world. We can't override the spontaneous processes of trial and error that are the very embodiment of the social order. We can't presume to know things that we cannot know. The planning doesn't work. And then he stops and proceeds to lay out, many examples in his mind of the kind of planning that we should be willing to tolerate. It's like, thanks a lot, Hayek. And look, Walter Block, has hammered Hayek on this point, just countlessly. And I don't disagree. I must say I don't disagree. But I think it's a very uncharitable way to read Hayek, because I don't think anybody, look, if what you want is an anarchist thinker, go read your anarchist thinker, right? So, I mean, if you can start reading Hayek with understanding that he was an old school classical liberal who tolerated probably more interventions than even the classical liberals of the 19th century. Once you understand that, then you can just, if you just want to edit those out as you're reading, that's fine. Read his pure argument and see where it goes and see what you can get from it. I've said this many, many times. I think it's, if you're going to undertake into an intellectual exercise and seek to live a life of the mind, it's a precondition that we stop looking for saintly thinkers to beatify and canonize as being perfect, and we have to stop looking for witches that we want to burn at the stake. If you could just rule out the saints and rule out the witches, and just try to get the thing that you want from the thing you're reading, you'll be much better off. You're going to find plenty of mistakes in Hayek, and I don't think there's any question about that. But if you let those distract you from the core of his argument, then you've lost the bigger picture. And what is that core? I mean, this book that came out in 1944 was one of the century's biggest blows against the planning state, whether it comes from the left or it comes from the right. It was a mighty tribute to freedom that blew everybody away. And it was awesome. And it still is awesome. If you take seriously the core of the book, the core of the theoretical argument, you will, I think, arrive at a really radical position that Hayek himself might have resisted, So I think that's the right way to understand it. And there's no question that was the upshot of this book. So I've already mentioned to you what I think Hayek's message was to the left, which was that you are morally culpable for the very fascism you claim to oppose, right? So what was his message to the right, to the conservatives, to the Tories, to the American Republicans, to the nascent conservative movement in the United States? His message to the right around the world was, you keep looking for your enemy on the left, but the enemy may be within your own ranks. You might be reinventing a form of socialism that you don't recognize because you're so caught up in being against the left, so terrified of red socialism, that you're not recognizing the form of authoritarianism that's arising within your ranks right now. And you don't recognize it because it's got a different cultural style. It's got a different kind of leadership principle. It's got a different, team. It's team B instead of team A. You're glad that team A is being crushed. Thank you, team B. But then you're going to turn around and discover that team B is as much a threat to individualism and liberty as team A was. So don't get caught up in that trap. Hayek specifically warns against the coming of not so much red socialism, but fascism under a technocratic regime of scientific elites that have a pretensions of knowledge. They think that they can plan, and they get into power based on the conditions of economic chaos and democratic decline that perhaps the left created, but nonetheless the right benefits from. So he's setting out to warn you and me and everybody that there are forms of socialism that are not called socialism that are just as dangerous, and they're just as united on the principle of authoritarian, totalitarian, coercive control of society. And of course, if you've read any of my writings over the last year or a few years, certainly over the last months, I believe that this is an argument that we need to take really seriously. Again, Hayek warns, Because I mean, Hayek never believed that red socialism was a danger in the UK and the United States. I mean, despite every red scare in the 1920s and the 1950s, and you know, you name it, and still, you know, all throughout until the end of the Cold War, and even now, real socialism of the traditional red sort has never been a danger in his mind. The real, the true and present danger, the thing that's something we need to look out for, are the forms of socialism that are supported by the alienated bourgeoisie, not so much the intellectuals. The intellectuals tend to be reds, right? But the alienated bourgeoisie tends to be the browns, and he's much more worried about the practical danger that's this kind of populist, you know, class-based politics of resentment means. Well, and I think this is a message we need to hear, mainly because I think our instincts, I'm speaking, when I say our, I mean among libertarians, our instincts are finely honed to spot the left egalitarianism and its fallacies, to rail against their victim-based policies, to be, you know, deeply troubled and actually deeply offended by their constant attacks on private property and the wealthy, their arguments for redistribution. But we don't have much of a nose, because we're not well trained in it, for the forms of socialism that come from the right, that guarantee protection for the family, for religion, that celebrate a community, that argue for homogeneity in a nation, that demonizes the other. And Hayek talks all about this. I mean, he's got fascism down like perfectly, and he never fails to draw its connection to left socialism. He's got right fascism down. He's got a beautiful passage in there about enemies, that the consolidation of political power has to use the presence of enemies, whether it's the Jews or the kulaks or some invading foreigner. You have to have an enemy to rally up the masses under some weird, imagined, homogeneous, united plan for the nation, where everybody's values have to be combined, and we all have to, you know, gather together under the great leadership principle to achieve that. I mean, it's very interesting when you read the book, because if you're reading it in 2015, you know, it's like every other page is like, oh, he's talking about Sanders. Oh, he's talking about Trump. Oh, he's talking about Sanders. Oh, he's talking about Trump. I mean, you just kind of keep bouncing back and forth. I mean, so it's awesome, because it trains your political instincts to sort of get hip to what's going on here. Now, I want to read, and I hope you don't mind if I do this, because I as I was reading through it, I thought, you know, I don't know anybody who's read this book that carefully. But before I do, I want to read the chapter on how the worst get to the top, because it's got a very important point to make, and I'll get into that in a second. But just to back up, he very early on in the book isolates something that both the left and the right have in common, and it's their war against competition, that neither of them are happy with competitive markets. Now, that's a little bit of a surprise, right? I mean, we don't hear that in political rhetoric anymore. There's no party that stands for competition, right? For market competition. The more I think about this, though, the more I think this is actually correct. Competition as an institution, as a principle of commercial life, is bound up with liberalism. Because if you think about it, with competition, it requires unified rules and not a different set of rules for some players versus others. No players have disabilities, and no players have legal advantages. It's a level playing field, and nobody knows the outcome. It's just a game. The game analogy is used much later by Hayek in his 1974 a Nobel lecture, but it might as well apply to road serfdom too. Is competition means like an open field of spontaneous play on the part of everybody. So anybody can enter, anybody, and all businesses are tested by the profit system that determines their success or failure based on their capacity for serving the consuming public, for serving society. And I think this is really true. Obviously, there's things about competition that the left doesn't like. I mean, you think back to the New Deal. FDR starts his reign of terror with, big attacks on competitive enterprise. So, but what does he default to? I mean, he creates the Blue Eagle program that cartelizes industry. He's handpicking, this industry will survive, this one will die. Here's a massive regulations that are going to disable your competition and give you therefore advantages in the marketplace. All right, so that's what FDR style social democracy, for lack of a better term, really amounted to. And meanwhile, in Germany under fascism, this is a radically anti-competitive system too. A cartelized system that gives certain privileges, state subsidies, high levels of regulation, various forms of government intervention to players in the commercial marketplace that the state approves of, and thereby disabling everybody else, meaning that it stops competition. I mean, think back to the first book that Ludwig Erhard, he was the finance minister after the war in Germany, and Germany was a complete shambles, and Erhard came along and dismantled all the Nazi-style economic controls, price controls. But in particular, he had targeted the cartelization devices that turned, the whole of German industry into an industrial army under state control, dismantled all those regulations. It was sort of the deregulation that was a very big part of his agenda. But his book was called Prosperity and Competition, I think is the name of the book. Somebody can look it up, Ludwig Erhard. And it was a book written, and it surprised me when I first read it, because it was a book written not for the intellectuals. It was a book arguing for competition as the right kind of economic system, have a competitive market economy. It wasn't written for intellectuals. It wasn't written for consumers. It wasn't written for public servants. It was a book written for the business people of Germany, and particularly the captains of industry, trying to explain the competition was good for them, because they were the ones to overcome. I mean, business doesn't like competition. And we see this again and again. Anytime you look at any government regulation, attempt to crack down on a particular practice out there, it's almost a guarantee every time that the hand of some established business is behind it. That's just the way it works. And I don't care if you can go back to the Standard Oil case. It doesn't matter. You look at patent laws, copyright laws. That's the way healthcare business paying for healthcare happened into the U.S. because it was initially introduced by large businesses as a way of getting around wage controls. But later, the businesses that had adopted it saw that it was going to be advantageous to them to mandate it across the whole of the population, thereby squeezing out businesses that didn't and couldn't provide their healthcare. So it was an attempt to sort of make the corporate economy less competitive. I'm writing an article right now on the case of handmade soaps. Actually, I hope to have it done by the end of the night tonight. But it's fascinating. I'm looking at this right now. Like, it's weird. There aren't too many competitive industries left in the world. Actually, what you look at, one of them is like, I forget now which president implemented it, but deregulated beer. So now you have all these craft beers. There's probably one in your town. There's probably like 5 in your town. You go to new restaurants now, and they all making their own beer. And it's an awesome thing. There's gazillion billion beers in the world, whereas 30 years ago there were like 5. So the market for beer production has been largely deregulated, and we see this amazing flourishing of beer take place. Now, what if Budweiser decided, look, this has just gone too far, and we're losing too many profits? What's the first thing you do? You're going to go out and try to regulate beer. Are you going to say it's because we want to boost our profits? No, it's in the name of protecting consumers from bad products. We've got a very bad thing. We've got chaos going on. Consumers are being robbed. We need to bring some sort of order to this place, ending competition. So another case of the soap market, we face the same thing. I mean, like a virtual free market in soap making in this country. It's a fascinating thing. It's just the government never got around to regulating soaps, except for a handful of lines in the federal code, like soap has to be made of the following things. But it's very broad, and anybody can comply with it. So as a result, I mean, it's actually a remarkable thing, despite the first big soap manufacturers having achieved almost complete market dominance by like the 1970s or whatever. Their whole monopoly has been eaten away by this amazing explosion of homemade soaps. There's something like 300,000, and that's a figure that's being used by the trade association that represents these places. 300,000 individual vendors for handmade soaps in this country. Isn't that remarkable? 95% of which are owned by women, and almost all of which have between 1 and 3 employees. I mean, it's amazing. You start Googling up handmade soaps. I mean, it's not just Etsy, which has a gazillion of them, but there's every web domain name you can possibly think of. Handmade soaps out there. I mean, they're really eating away. I mean, it's a beautiful example, and with incredibly creative soaps. I mean, soaps that you never thought would exist, and at increasingly low prices too. So it's a beautiful example to me of what competition actually looks like. It doesn't mean that markets are dominated by top players and they can use their market power to drive everybody out. That happens when they have state privileges. But if you have a deregulated environment where there are very simple rules that apply to everybody equally, the market power of the guys on top is never a sure thing. It's always constantly under threat, and they'll face this unrelenting pressure to improve and lower prices, become ever more efficient, ever more subservient of the consuming class. That's what competition looks like in reality. Well, the left hates it, the right hates it. I think Hayek is exactly right about this, to focus on this point as a uniting factor between the left and the right. So this resentment against competition. So he makes an argument for it. Okay, now, before I read to you, and I don't know how far I'm going to get in the chapter, I'd like to read some of it to give you a taste of what this book is like. Perhaps the most famous chapter in the book is called "Why the Worst Get on Top." I think it's chapter 6 or something like that. You have to look it up. So why did he write the chapter? Well, it's designed to address a peculiar thing that was going on in England, and you could say the same thing that's going on in the U.S. today. That people would easily make the argument that, yeah, look, despotic systems of control, violations of property rights, totalist style government, big government rule, looks very ugly in Russia. But look who got in charge. I mean, it was just a bunch of thugs. Of course they're going to mess it up. They did mess it up. They used the system to reward themselves and pillage everybody else. And in Germany, same situation. I mean, after Germany's economic crisis, just real jerks came into power. And of course, they abused their power. That's what you get when you get the wrong group of leaders. But England's not that way. If we have English form of totalitarianism, English form of socialism, it's going to be actually very lovely. The leaders will respect rights. They will guarantee that the big government controls, totalist controls, are exercised in a humanitarian and liberal sort of fashion. So whatever the experiences of Russia and Germany and whatever kind of crazy Latin American country, forget Spain and Italy, those are not instructive for the English and American case, because we have a long history of being, we're very civilized people. So the experiences there have no bearing really on what we should do in our country. So that was the argument. Well, Hayek addressed this with a very explicit point that actually totalitarianism attracts the worst and causes otherwise moral and decent people to do terribly immoral things. So I just want to kind of read this to you, because I would like to leave you with something other than just the chapter title, which is very famous. You see it all the time. People say, well, as Hayek said, the worst get on top. Now, he wasn't just saying bad people tend to run for political office, which is more or less true enough. But that's not always true. I mean, his argument is actually much more subtle. It's that, to echo Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So it's the power itself that becomes corrupting of even the best people. So let me just read a little bit for you. I don't know. I'd love to read you the whole chapter, but I just want you to get a flavor for what this book is like, and then maybe you'll be inspired to read more of it. It's chapter 10, Why the Worst Get on Top. We must now examine a belief from which many who regard the advent of totalitarianism as inevitable derive consolation, and which seriously weakens the resistance of many others who would oppose it with all their might, if they fully apprehended its nature. It is the belief that the most repellent features of the totalitarian regimes are due to the historical accident that they were established by groups of blackguards and thugs. Surely, it is argued, if in Germany the creation of a totalitarian regime brought the Strykers and Killingers and Leys and Heinz, the Himmlers and Heydrichs to power, this may prove the viciousness of the German character, but not that the rise of such people is a necessary consequence of a totalitarian system. Why should it not be possible that that same sort of system, if it be necessary to achieve important ends, be run by decent people for the good of the community as a whole? We must not deceive ourselves into believing that all good people must be Democrats or will necessarily wish to have a share in the government. Many, no doubt, would rather entrust it to somebody whom they think more competent. Although this might be unwise, there's nothing good or dishonorable in approving of the dictatorship of the good. Totalitarianism, we can already hear it argued, is a powerful system alike for good and evil, and the purpose for which it will be used depends entirely on the dictators and those who think that it is not the system which we need to fear, but the danger that it might be run by bad men, might even be tempted to forestall this danger by seeing that it is established in time, that it is established in time by good men. Hayek goes on. No doubt an English fascist system would greatly differ from Italian or German models, and no doubt if the transition were effected without violence, we might expect to get a better type of leader. And if I had to live under a fascist system, I have no doubt that I'd rather live under one run by the Englishman than under one run by anybody else. That's a very funny line. Yet all this does not mean that, judged by our present standards, a British fascist system would, in the end, prove so very different or more or less intolerable than its prototypes. There are strong reasons for believing that what to us appear the worst features of the existing totalitarian systems are not accidental byproducts, but phenomena which totalitarianism is certain sooner or later to produce. Just as the democratic statesman who sets out to plan economic life will soon be confronted with the alternative of either assuming dictatorial powers or abandoning his plans, so the totalitarian dictator would soon have to choose between disregard of ordinary morals and failure. It is for this reason that the unscrupulous and uninhibited are likely to be more successful in a society tending towards totalitarianism. Who does not see this has not yet grasped the full width of the gulf that separates totalitarianism from a liberal regime, the utter difference between the whole moral atmosphere under collectivism and the essentially individualist Western civilization. The moral basis of collectivism has, of course, been much debated in the past, but what concerns us here is not its moral basis, but its moral results. The usual discussions of the ethical aspects of collectivism refer to the question whether collectivism is demanded by the existing moral convictions, or what moral convictions would be required if collectivism is to produce the hoped-for results. One question, however, is what moral views will be produced by a collectivist organization of society, or what views are likely to rule it. The interaction between morals and institutions may well have the effect that the ethics produced by collectivism will be altogether different from the moral ideals that lead to the demand for collectivism. And while we are apt to think that, since the desire for a collectivist system springs from high moral motives, such a system must be the breeding ground for the highest virtues. There is, in fact, no reason why any system should necessarily enhance those attitudes which serve the purpose for which it is designed. The ruling moral views will depend partly on the qualities that will lead individuals to success in a collectivist or totalitarian system, and partly on the requirements of the totalitarian machinery. To Hayek, it just doesn't matter. I mean, it just doesn't matter how good your leaders are, or how wonderful they are, how moral they are, how well-intended they are. To be successful, they have to become very bad. We must here return for a moment to the position which precedes the suppression of democratic institutions and the creation of a totalitarian regime. In this stage, it is the general demand for a quick and determined government action that is a dominating element of the situation. Dissatisfaction with the slow and cumbersome course of democratic procedure, which makes action for action's sake the goal. It is then the man or party who seems strong and resolute enough to get things done, who exercises the greatest appeal. Strong in this sense means not merely a numerical majority. It is the ineffectiveness of parliamentary majorities with which people are dissatisfied. Congress, Supreme Court, the regulators. What they will seek is somebody with such solid support as to inspire confidence that he can carry out whatever he wants. Whatever he wants. It is here that the new type of party, organized on military lines, comes in. Fascinating, isn't it? Okay. In the Central European countries, the socialist parties had familiarized the masses with political organizations of a semi-military character designed to absorb as much as possible of the private life of the members. And all that was wanted was to give one group overwhelming power to carry out the same principles somewhat further, to seek strength not in the assured votes of huge numbers of occasional elections, but in the absolute and unreserved support of a smaller but more thoroughly organized body. The chance of imposing a totalitarian regime on a whole people depends on the leader first collecting round him a group which is prepared to voluntarily submit to that totalitarian discipline, which they are there to impose by force upon the rest. Although the socialist parties had the strength to get anything if they cared to use force, they were reluctant to do. They had, without knowing it, set themselves a task which only the ruthless, ready to disregard the barriers of accepted morals, can execute. That socialism can be put into practice only by the methods which most socialists disapprove is, of course, a lesson learned by many social reformers of the past. The old socialist parties were inhibited by the democratic ideals. They did not possess the ruthlessness required for the performance of their chosen task. It was a characteristic that both in Germany and in Italy, the success of fascism was preceded by the refusal of the socialist parties to take over the responsibility of government. Too squeamish, too squeamish. Kind of like Obamacare, too squeamish to socialize. They were unwilling wholeheartedly to employ the methods to which they had pointed the way. They still hoped for the miracle of a majority agreeing on a particular plan for the organization of the whole society. Others had already learned the lesson that in a planned society, the question can no longer be on what majority of people agree, but what is the largest single group whose members agree sufficiently to make unified direction of all affairs possible, or if no such group large enough to enforce its views exists, how it can be created, and who will succeed in creating it. There are three main reasons why such a numerous and strong group with fairly homogeneous views is not likely to be formed by the best, but rather by the worst elements of any society. By our standards, the principle on which such a group would be selected would be almost entirely negative. In the first instance, it's probably true that in general, the higher the education and intelligence of individuals becomes, the more their views and tastes are differentiated, and the less likely they are to agree on a particular hierarchy of values. It is a corollary of this that if we wish to find a high degree of uniformity and similarity of outlook, we have to descend to the regions of lower moral and intellectual standards, where the more primitive and common instincts and tastes prevail. This does not mean that the majority of people have low moral standards. It just means that merely that the largest group of people whose values are very similar are the people with low standards. It is, as it were, the lowest common denominator which unites the largest number of people. Do you understand what he's saying here? And by the way, I have to apologize for that. I'm getting a text on Gmail and it's kind of interrupting things a little bit. If a numerous group is needed, strong enough to impose their wills on the values of life and all the rest, it will never be those with highly differentiated and developed tastes. It will be those who form the mass in the derogatory sense of the term, the least original and independent, who will be able to put the weight of their numbers behind their particular ideals. You think about this as you think about American elections today. If, however, a potential dictator had to rely entirely on those whose uncomplicated and primitive instincts happen to be very similar, their number would scarcely give sufficient weight. Oh, I've got to turn this off. I'm so sorry. Okay. Well, this is a mess. I can't seem to find it. I'm sorry to make a mess of this. I did not anticipate that. And unfortunately, in the course of doing that, I think I just closed the book I was just reading. I did. Well, I hope I didn't ruin the hangout. It's my fault. I failed to prepare. There's much more to say about this. Okay, I'm going to avoid cursing right now. I actually feel like doing it. Hold on. I might be able to kill this thing. Oh, here we go. Okay. I don't think I did. And now I've lost my train of thought, and now I've also lost my tab. I wanted to keep reading at least all the way to the end of the chapter. I'm so sorry. But in any case, we're running out of time. I hope I whetted your appetite and gave you a sense of just how subtle and powerful his argument is, and how democracy can produce this kind of totalitarian system. Hold on. I'm going to have to fix this computer to make sure that never happens again. So you can see that this is not just the crude argument that some people just throw out there, that like, if you create a welfare state, it's going to create socialism, we'll all die. I mean, that is not Hayek's argument. Hayek is warning against all forms of totalitarianism from the left and the right. And in fact, he thinks in the UK and the US, whether the pressure comes from the left or from the right, what you're going to end up with is a kind of totalist system that destroys competition and leads to the end of individualism and subverts the ability of society to develop in a spontaneous way that serves the mass of people, and that there's a particular political dynamic that takes place in democratic developed societies. It's spooky. I can tell you, my friends, it's spooky to read this book because you see these pressures all around us. I'm not somehow announcing to you that, oh, look, Hitler's in our midst. I think there's a sense in which Hitler is always in our midst. Mussolini is always in our midst. I mean, Stalin's always in our midst. There's always the threat, that of the creation of total states. So long as you have the intellectuals who believe in these kinds of ideas, masses of people that have relatively homogeneous political demands and interests, and a political system that rewards the kind of demagoguery, to give rise to these systems as a fix for some prevailing crisis. I mean, this is the story of the rise of the total state. I mean, it's a tragic story, but I can tell you, Hayek nailed it. I mean, he nails it in this book, in chapter after chapter after chapter. It's a brilliant and systematic argument. You see why I'm impatient with people that want to pick apart, his intellectual deviations and his inconsistencies. I mean, if you do that, if that's the way you render the book, you're going to lose a great deal of insight that he has, and it's just a pointless undertaking, really. I mean, to my mind, I mean, there's plenty wrong with Hayek. All right, so I get it, right? But you can see that where he's good, he's great, he's epic, he's awesome, and I would say that, I mean, there's so much of Hayek bears reading, but Road to Serfdom deserves its fame. It wasn't an accident that it became his most famous work, and one of the most famous pro-freedom books of the 20th century. I think it's all deserved. Well, maybe I'll do a second night on Road to Serfdom. I'm sorry I got interrupted in my reading. I think I would actually like to, because there's so much more to this book. Thanks for joining me tonight. This hour went by like, wow, like that, right? It's my first time to actually talk about the book publicly. So, and I was thrilled. One of the reasons I love doing this is that it gives me a chance to kind of dip into books that I think I know and read them and go, oh, I don't even remember anything about this. This is awesome. So that's what's beautiful about these hours, about these weekly sessions we have. But I tell you what, there are very few books that really hold up to repeated readings, or that can, give you like massive payoff for revisiting them, even if you already think you know what's in them. But certainly, Road to Serfdom is right up there. The problem with modern politics, the problem with being alive in a political moment like we have around us, is that sometimes we lose track of the forest for the trees, wandering from tree to tree to tree, and not looking at the bigger picture, and not looking at it with a kind of a distance and an informed theoretical sense to kind of understand what's happening, so that we can detach ourselves from it. What's the point of understanding? So that we can detach ourselves from it, so we can become dispassionate and live a life that's most advantageous to us, and make our highest possible contribution to keeping the world on the right track. That's why we do this. That's why we read books. That's why we go to people like Hayek as guides, and he was a great one. He was a genius, just a real, Road to Serfdom was a great gift to the world when it came out in 1944. The world was in crisis. It's a gift that keeps on giving all the way up into the 21st century. The level of wisdom, the profound insight is there, like few other books you ever read. And again, this is not a book for the average person. I'm sorry to say. It's too high level. It's too difficult. And the argument is subtle and powerful and devastating. But I think it will help you. It will help you see things. It certainly helped me. So I'm grateful to have a chance to share my experience with the book with you. And maybe I will propose this to Mike Reed, who's the sort of the administrator of this room, that I do another night on Road to Serfdom. I can pick up reading where I was. We can talk a little bit more about it. If you would like that, I think I would too, because there's just not enough time to go into it enough. Thank you again. Thank you for being a member of our community. It's wonderful to have you at Liberty.me. It gives me constant hope. I know it gives hope to you. I so often reflect on this community and its meaning for you as an individual, on my life, and for the status of liberty all over the world. I think we're doing great things together. Thank you, my friends. All the best.